deep beneath the shadowed peaks of Middle-earth, where the fires of Mount Doom burn eternal, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and unmatched craftsmanship began, one that would shape the destiny of an entire world. Picture this: the greatest elven smith of his age, Celebrimbor, standing in the halls of Eregion, his hands skilled enough to shape beauty from raw stone, his mind ablaze with the desire to create something never before seen. And then, into his life steps a stranger cloaked in golden light, calling himself Annator, the Lord of Gifts. But beneath that fair guise lurked Sauron, the Dark Lord himself, whispering promises of knowledge so profound it could forge rings of unimaginable power. The stage was set for a deception that would echo through the ages, and today we're unraveling every secret behind the forging of the great rings of power. Tell me, where are you joining us from tonight, and what hour has your journey into this ancient legend begun? Let us know in the comments below. There's something magical about sharing this story across time zones, as if we're all gathered around the same fireside, listening to a tale spun from the very threads of history. Because this isn't just a story of metal and magic, it's a story of trust, twisted into treachery, of artistry lured into darkness, and of the delicate balance between creation and corruption. From the first flicker of Sauron's deception to the moment the rings passed into the hands of kings, elves, and dwarves, every step was a masterpiece of manipulation. The rings weren't simply forged, they were designed to ensnare, to bind, to control. Yet in Celebrimbor's hands, they also became objects of breathtaking beauty, proof that even in the shadow of evil, greatness can emerge. So settle in, because we're about to walk through the smith's fires together, tracing the intricate steps of their making and uncovering the hidden truths behind Middle-earth's most legendary artifacts. The story of the rings is waiting, and it's more riveting than you ever imagined. Celebrimbor stood at the crossroads of legacy and doubt, his fingers tracing the designs that would soon reshape the fate of Middle-earth. The allure of Annator's knowledge was impossible to resist. Here was a chance to surpass even the works of his grandfather, Fëanor, whose creations had once lit the heavens. Yet as the forges of Eregion roared to life, a quiet unease threaded through the elven smith's thoughts. Annator's words were honeyed, his techniques flawless, but there was something in the way the shadows clung to him when he thought no one was watching. Still, pride drowned out caution. What elf could turn away from the chance to craft something eternal? Day after day, the two smiths bent over their work, their hammers striking in harmony as molten gold and silver twisted into forms both delicate and terrible. Annator spoke of unity, of lifting Middle-earth into a new age of glory, but his eyes lingered too long on the sketches of the rings, especially the three greatest, meant for the elves alone. The other artisans of Eregion exchanged glances, their hands pausing mid-task as whispers spread. Why did the air grow heavy when Annator passed? Why did the flames in the forges sometimes flicker green, as if fed by something other than wood or coal? Yet Celebrimbor pressed on, driven by a craftsman's obsession. Each ring they designed was a masterpiece, its circuitry of spells and enchantments more intricate than the last. The lesser rings came first, experiments in blending elven grace with the stranger, sharper arts Annator brought. But as the designs for the great rings took shape, so too did the divide in their visions. Celebrimber dreamed of preservation, of slowing time's decay, of healing the fractures in the world. Annator, though, smiled as he murmured of order, of strength, of a will that could bind all things to its purpose. The elves of Eregion rarely slept in those days. The glow of the forges lit their halls even at midnight, and the wind carried the scent of hot metal and something darker, like the tang of lightning before a storm. Some began to avoid the workshops altogether, their songs fading from the anvils. But Celebrimber, his hands stained with ash and his eyes alight with feverish inspiration, scarcely noticed. The rings were nearly ready, and somewhere, deep in the heart of Mordor, the fires of Orodruin stirred in answer. The first rings emerged from the forges not as objects of overwhelming power, but as delicate proofs of possibility, whispering promises of what might come. Celebrimber cradled one in his palm, a slender band of silver, etched with runes so fine they shimmered like spiderwebs in dawn light. It was beautiful, yes, but more than that, it worked. The enchantments hummed against his skin, a subtle resonance that quickened his pulse. Across the workshop, Annator nodded approval, his golden hair catching the firelight like a halo. "See," he murmured, "the foundation is laid. Now imagine what greater things we might weave into the metal." But Narvi, the young apprentice who had ground pigments for Celebrimber's designs since she could hold a mortar, set down her tools with a clatter. Her hands were smudged with soot, her braids frayed from hours bent over the bellows. "Master," she said quietly, "the spells you're binding, they don't just preserve. They pull." She hesitated, then lifted a scrap of parchment where she'd sketched the flow of energies in the ring's circuitry. "Look how the threads converge. Not outward to sustain, but inward to gather." Celebrimber barely glanced at the drawing. "All power requires a conduit," he countered, already turning back to the work table. "This is mere theory made manifest. Annator has shown us pathways even the Valor might envy." His fingers brushed a half-formed ring, and the metal seemed to sigh under his touch. Narvi's jaw tightened. She'd seen the way Annator's shadow stretched too long against the walls when he thought himself unobserved, how the lesser rings grew warm in his presence, not from the forge, but as if answering some silent call. "Theories have consequences," she insisted. "You taught me that. What if the conduit becomes a chain?" For a heartbeat, the workshop fell still. Then Celebrimber laughed, the sound bright and brittle. "Trust your master, child, or do you doubt my craft?" The words were gentle, but his eyes held a challenge. Narvi swallowed her protests. What could she say? To question further would be to question him, the smith, whose bloodline had birthed the Silmarils, whose skill had shaped the very lamps of the Noldor. Yet that night, as Narvi banked the coals, she caught Annator standing before the racks of unfinished rings, his lips moving in a chant, too low to hear. The air around him throbbed, and for an instant, the rings glowed not with reflected fire, but with a sickly, hungry green. Then the moment passed. Annator turned, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Rest well," he told her. "Tomorrow we begin the greater work." And in the shadows, Narvi clenched her soot-stained hands, knowing what she'd seen, and fearing what her master refused to. Sauron watched Celebrimbor's hands shape the molten metal with an artist's precision, his own lips curling into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The elf's obsession was blooming beautifully, his hunger for mastery outstripping his caution, just as planned. And so, with the patience of a spider weaving its web, Annator began to unfurl deeper layers of his so-called gifts. One evening, as the forge's embers glowed crimson, he leaned over Celebrimbor's shoulder and traced a finger along a half-finished ring's inner rim. "Power," he murmured, "is not merely poured into the metal. It must be bound, threaded to the wearer's very will, like veins to a heart." Celebrimbor stilled, his chisel hovering mid-stroke. The idea was intoxicating. To craft rings that didn't just hold magic, but answered to their bearers. This was the pinnacle of his art. Annator's voice dropped lower, weaving through the clang of hammers like smoke. Imagine a ring that amplifies the soul's intent, that bends the world itself to the wearer's desire. Not just preservation, but dominion. The word hung in the air, heavy and sweet as forged smoke. For days, Celebrimbor scarcely slept, his dreams filled with spiraling designs that pulsed like living things. He sketched feverishly, scattering parchment across his chambers, each stroke of his pen pulling him further from the light of his people's wisdom. The other smiths of Eregion noticed the change, the way his laughter grew rare, his gaze distant, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. But none dared intervene. Who were they to question the heir of Feanor's legacy? Yet even as Celebrimbor surrendered to Annator's teachings, a sliver of unease prickled at him. Late one night, hunched over his workbench, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a polished silver bowl. His eyes shadowed, his face gaunt. The rings they'd forged together thrummed in their caskets, their song almost audible. Dominion, they seemed to whisper, but dominion over what? It was then, in that fragile moment of doubt, that Celebrimbor made a choice. He would craft 3 rings apart from Annator's influence, rings untainted by the stranger's 2 perfect hands. In a hidden workshop, veiled by spells of silence, he began Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. Their designs were different, their purpose purer, not to bind, but to inspire. To heal, to resist the slow unraveling of all things fair. The work was agony. Every hammer strike felt like a betrayal of Annator's trust, every incantation a risk. But as the first of the 3 took shape, Narya, its ruby gleaming like a captured dawn, Celebrimbor felt something he hadn't in months. Hope. Perhaps these rings could undo what the others might wreak. Perhaps they could be a light when the shadow came, but shadows have a way of creeping under doors. On the eve of the 3's completion, a draft snuffed out Celebrimbor's lantern, though no window was open. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, laughter echoed soft, knowing, and far too close. The 7 and the 9 took shape under the smith's hands, their bands gleaming like frozen starlight against the soot-darkened anvils of Eregion. At first glance, they seemed no different from the earlier experiments, elegant, intricate, laden with the delicate traceries of elven craft. But those who listened closely heard it, a faint, discordant hum beneath the metal song, like a lute string tuned just a hair too tight. Celebrimbor told himself it was merely the strain of pushing their art beyond known limits. Hadn't his grandfather done the same, bending the laws of creation to forge the Silmarils? Greatness required risk. Annator's presence loomed larger now, his fingers brushing the unfinished rings as if testing their weight, not in the hand, but in the soul. He spoke of tailoring the 7 for dwarven lords, their enchantments woven to stoke ambition, to make stone whisper secrets and gold multiply in vaults. For the 9, he proposed subtler threads, whispers of wisdom to mortal kings, gifts to stretch their fleeting lives into something resembling the agelessness of elves. Think of it, he murmured, as a sharing of grace. Who are we to hoard such wonders? Celebrimbor's hands hesitated over the 9th ring, its band carved with runes that prickled his skin like static. The design was flawless, yet something in the symbol's curl reminded him of vines strangling a tree. This binding, he said slowly, it feels heavier than the others. Annator's laughter was a blade wrapped in silk. Weight is the price of transcendence. Even Lothian traded her immortality for love. Will you deny these kings their chance at glory? And so the work continued. The rings grew heavier still, though the scales could not measure it. Their beauty dazzled gold inlaid with adamant, silver threaded with mithril. But the smiths found their dreams troubled by visions of grasping hands and towers, crumbling under their own weight. One craftsman, an old Noldor who had once lit lanterns in Valinor, threw down his hammer and fled the forge, muttering of snakes coiled in the metal. Celebrimbor alone remained steadfast, his doubt buried beneath layers of justification. The rings would unite Middle-earth, he told himself. They would stave off decay, buy time for the light to regrow. And if Annator's methods were unorthodox, well, when had tradition ever birthed anything extraordinary? Yet late that night, as he etched the final sigil onto the last of the 9, the ring flared hot in his palm, not with the forge's warmth, but with a feverish, insistent pulse. For one terrible instant, Celebrimbor saw not the workshop around him, but a vast, lidless eye wreathed in flame, its gaze pinning him like a moth to a needle. Then the vision vanished. The ring lay cool and innocent in his hand. Across the chamber, Annator smiled, gold hair haloed by torchlight. Beautiful, he said softly. Now you understand true power. Narvi's fingers trembled as she ran them along the inner edge of the Dwarven King's unfinished ring, the 7th of its kind, its gold still warm from the forge. The runes shimmered as they caught the light, beautiful and precise, but beneath their artistry lurked something else, a shadow, a whisper. She'd spent nights tracing the patterns in secret, comparing them to the oldest Dwarven ward symbols she'd learned as a child, and what she found chilled her to the bone. These weren't just enchantments for endurance or strength. They were hooks. She found Celebrimbor at dawn, hunched over his work table, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "Master," she said, her voice unsteady, "these bindings, they don't just amplify, they anchor." She unrolled a scrap of vellum between them, her own shaky sketches overlaying Annator's designs. "See how the energy loops back. The wearer doesn't command the ring commands them." Celebrimbor's face darkened. He reached for the parchment, but his hands froze mid-motion, as if some part of him already knew the truth. "You overstep, Narvi," he muttered. "These are workings beyond your..." "Then explain them to me," she snapped, the words cracking like a whip. "Tell me why the runes for enduring will are twisted with the black speech of Mordor." The moment the accusation left her lips, the air in the workshop turned thick, suffocating. Somewhere in the halls beyond, a door creaked open, though no breeze stirred. Celebrimbor stood abruptly, his chair screeching against stone. "You speak of things you don't understand. Annator's knowledge comes from where?" Narvi's laugh was raw, desperate. He slithers around questions like a snake avoiding fire. Have you ever once seen him eat, sleep, even breathe too deeply? She grabbed his wrist, pressing his palm to the seventh ring's cold metal. Feel it, really feel it. That's not power, it's a leash. For a heartbeat, the workshop pulsed with silence. Then Celebrimbor wrenched his hand away, his eyes flashing with something between fury and fear. Leave, the word was a blade. If you cannot trust my judgment, you have no place here. Narvi stumbled back, her chest tight. She'd expected denial, deflection. Not this hollow, hunted look in her master's eyes, as if he were already mourning something. Gathering her tools with shaking hands, she hesitated at the door. They'll destroy you, she whispered, and when they do, I pray you remember who tried to stop it. The roads out of Eregion were quieter than she'd ever known, the wind carrying the scent of burning herbs from the forges, a futile attempt to cleanse what couldn't be undone. She didn't look back, not when the first howls rang out from the deep woods, too guttural to be wolves, not when the stars themselves seemed to dim overhead. Her path led east now, to the dwarven halls and the scattered realms of men. They needed to know, they needed to run, and in the shadows of Eregion's tallest spire, Annator watched her go, his golden mask slipping at last. The hour was late, his patience thinner than the veneer of his fair form. The rings were nearly ready, the stage was set, and no frightened apprentice, no matter how clever, would be allowed to spoil the game. His fingers curled, and far below, the forges of Eregion roared to life once more, this time with no elven hands to steady the flames. Deep in the heart of Mount Doom, where rivers of fire carved their path through ancient stone, a shadow stirred. The air itself recoiled as Sauron, no longer hiding behind the fair mask of Annator, lifted the molten gold from the inferno. This was no ordinary crafting. This was a coronation of darkness. With every hammer strike, the very fabric of Middle-earth trembled. The One Ring took shape not as a trinket or tool, but as a masterwork of domination, its gold gleaming with an unnatural sheen, as if swallowing the firelight rather than reflecting it. And as Sauron whispered the final, terrible words of binding, words that seared the air like acid, a shockwave pulsed outward, invisible but undeniable. Somewhere in the forests of Lorien, leaves withered on their branches. In the depths of Khazad-dûm, dwarven miners dropped their picks, their bones vibrating with a primal dread they couldn't name. Celebrimbor, hunched over his workbench in Eregion, gasped as pain lanced through his temples. The Three Elven Rings Narya, Nenya, Vilya flared hot against his chest, where they lay hidden beneath his robes. Their song, usually a soft hum of comfort, now shrieked in warning. He staggered to the window, clutching the sill as his vision blurred. The horizon looked wrong, the sunset too crimson, the clouds twisting like wounded things. And then he felt it, a pull insistent and vile, tugging at the rings he'd crafted in secret. His breath came in ragged bursts. No, he whispered. No, no, no. But the truth crashed over him with the weight of a landslide. Every design Annator had praised, every technique he'd gifted, every whispered suggestion, all of it had been a snare. The lesser rings, the 7 and the 9, even the 3 in his trembling hands, they were bound irrevocably to the One's will. Galadriel's voice cut through his panic before he saw her. You felt it too. She stood in the doorway, her face ashen, the usually serene light in her eyes replaced by something jagged. Behind her, Elrond gripped the hilt of his dagger, his knuckles white. The shadow has a name now, Elrond said quietly, and it is laughing. Celebrimbor's hands shook as he tore the three from their hiding place. We can't let him take them. They are already tainted, Galadriel interrupted, though her voice held more sorrow than accusation. The moment he forged his ring, the connection was made. But we can still deny him their use. Her fingers closed around Nenya, its diamond flickering like a star behind storm clouds. Hide them, scatter them. Give them to hands he will never suspect. That night, under a moon veiled by smoke, Celebrimbor made his choice. Narya, ring of fire and resilience, he entrusted to Círdan the shipwright, whose harbor eyes had seen ages come and go. Vilya, strongest of the three, he pressed into Elrond's palm with a silent plea. And Nenya, its power woven with preservation, with memory Galadriel took without a word, though her gaze promised something fiercer than farewell. As the three bearers slipped into the darkness, Celebrimbor turned back to the empty forge. The air still smelled of hot metal and betrayal. Somewhere, far to the east, Ordruin's fires burned brighter than ever. He didn't bother locking the doors when the first orcish horns echoed through the valley. Let them come. Let them see what happened when a craftsman realized, too late, that his greatest work had become a weapon. The last thing Celebrimbor reached for wasn't a sword or a shield, but a simple engraving tool, the one Narvi had gifted him years ago. As heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, he scratched a single line into the anvil's edge. A warning, a plea, a fragment of hope for whoever might find it when the smoke cleared. Then the shadows swallowed the room whole. The elves who survived the sack of Eregion would speak of strange things in the years to come, of how the wind sometimes carried the sound of hammering from abandoned forges, of how the three rings never answered Sauron's call, no matter how he raged. But in Mordor, where the Dark Lord clenched the one ring in his fist, the victory tasted oddly hollow, because somewhere, out in the vastness of Middle-earth, three sparks of defiance still flickered. And fire, as any smith knows, has a way of spreading. The first torches flickered on the horizon at dusk, their glow staining the sky like fresh blood. Celebrimbor stood atop Eregion's tallest spire, the 3 elven rings sewn into the lining of his cloak, their weight both a comfort and a curse. Below him, the city's white towers, once luminous with elven lamps, stood stark against the approaching shadow. The wind carried the metallic tang of armor and the guttural snarls of orcs, their drums throbbing like a diseased heartbeat. Sauron's patience had snapped. The Dark Lord would raise Eregion to ash rather than let a single ring slip beyond his grasp. Celebrimbor's fingers tightened around Nenya's hidden shape as he descended the spiral stairs. The corridors, once alive with the murmur of scholars and the chime of hammers, now echoed with the frantic shouts of soldiers barricading gates. A young elven scout, her face streaked with soot, caught his arm. The eastern bridge is overrun. They are herding prisoners toward the forges. Her voice cracked. They're asking for you by name. He didn't flinch. Then let them keep asking. Pressing a scroll into her hands, a map of hidden mountain passes. He gestured west. Find Gil-galad. Tell him the 3 must never meet the one. The scout hesitated. And you, Celebrimbor's smile was thin, sorrow etched into its edges. I bought this doom with my own pride. The least I can do is stall it. As she vanished into the smoke, he turned toward the armory, not for a sword, but for the oldest tool in his possession, a simple mallet, its handle worn smooth by centuries of use. Let Sauron send his legions. Let them tear the city stone from stone. They would find no rings here, only the echoes of a craftsman's defiance. Galadriel awaited him in the ruined courtyard, her cloak singed at the hem. She said nothing as he pressed Nenya into her palm. The diamond's glow dimmed by the smothering shadow of the one. Lindon, he urged, Círdan's ships are your only hope now. She gripped his wrist, her eyes blazing. This is not your death song, Celebrimbor, not yet. But the gates shattered before he could reply. The first orcs lurched through the breach, their jagged blades glinting. Celebrimbor shoved Galadriel toward the hidden postern gate, then turned, mallet raised, to face the tide. The last thing Eregion heard was not a scream, but a single, clear note, a smith's hammer striking adamant, ringing through the chaos like a bell. Some claimed it was the sound of Narya's final enchantment, flaring to life as Círdan fled down the Syrian. Others swore it was Celebrimbor's laughter, sharp with irony, as the Dark Lord's fist closed around empty air where the rings should have been. By dawn, the rivers ran black with ash. The forges, once Celebrimbor's pride, now spat twisted metal into the sky, and high above, unseen but undeniable, the Three Elven Rings hummed their quiet rebellion, carried far from the shadows reached by hands Sauron had never thought to watch. The dungeons beneath Barad-dûr reeked of charred flesh and despair, the air thick with the echoes of screams that never quite faded. Celebrimbor hung suspended by chains of blackened iron, his once fine robes reduced to tatters, his hands, those gifted hands that had shaped beauty from raw ore, now broken and bloodied. Yet when Sauron stepped from the shadows, his form wreathed in the hellish glow of Mount Doom's light. The elf lifted his head and met those burning eyes without flinching. "You misunderstand," he rasped, his voice raw from hours of torment. "The three were never yours to claim." Sauron's smile was a crack in the facade of his terrible majesty. "Every ring bears my mark," he murmured, trailing a clawed finger along Celebrimbor's shattered collarbone. "Even the ones you hid, their power answers to me now. You only delay the inevitable." A shudder ran through Celebrimbor's body as the Dark Lord's will pressed against his mind, a scalding tide, seeking the barest whisper of memory, a glimpse of Galadriel's face, a fragment of Círdan's shore, anything to betray the ring's paths. But the smith had spent centuries mastering the discipline of craft, of holding intricate designs in his thoughts without a single stray stroke. Now, he turned that focus inward, building walls of sheer defiance. The pain crested like a wave, but he clung to one image, Narya's ruby, glowing defiantly in Círdan's grasp as the last ships vanished into the mist. Sauron recoiled with a snarl. "Fool, you think your silence is a victory. Your people will scatter like leaves before my armies. Your forges will churn out weapons from my hand, and when the last elf kneels, I will peel the truth from their bones." Celebrimbor's laugh was a broken thing, yet it carried an echo of the smith's anvil. "You forged the one to bind the others," he wheezed, "but you never understood elven craft. The three were made to resist." His bleeding fingers twitched, as if tracing unseen runes in the air. "Every moment you waste torturing me, their light grows further from your reach." The Dark Lord's fist struck like a blacksmith's hammer, sending Celebrimbor's body swinging against the chains. But as the dungeon faded to black, the elf's lips moved in a final, soundless whisper, not a spell, not a plea, but a single word in the tongue of the Noldor: remember. When Sauron ordered the broken body hung upon a pole like a banner of conquest, the orcs cheered. Yet the wind that carried their cries westward also bore something else, a faint, silver shimmer in the air where no light should have been. And in the hidden places of Middle-earth, 3 rings pulsed gently in answer, their song unbroken. The rings slipped onto dwarven fingers like promises heavy with gold, whispering of hordes unseen and mountains yet unclaimed. At first, the lords of Khazad-dûm scoffed at the idea of enchantment. Stone and axe were their birthright, not sorcery. But as the years wound on, subtle changes took root. The 7 dwarven kings grew restless in their halls, their eyes lingering too long on locked vaults, their beards threaded with silver that never tarnished. Gold piled higher in their treasuries, yet their hunger only sharpened. Sauron's will scraped against their minds like a blade on whetstone, but dwarven souls burned stubborn as mithril in the forge. Corruption slithered in sideways, not through submission, but obsession. Mineshafts plunged deeper, past warnings carved in ancient stone. Songs of Durin's glory faded, replaced by the ceaseless clink of pickaxes. Men proved far less resilient. The 9 mortal kings who accepted their rings as gifts of power never stood a chance. Where dwarves bent, men shattered. The rings coiled around their wills like serpents, their promises of strength and longevity twisting into cruel irony. One by one, the kings faded not into death, but something worse. Their armor grew to their skin, their crowns to their skulls. The world around them dimmed, until only the scream of the Nazgûl's blades and the echo of Sauron's voice remained. They became shadows wearing crowns, their very breath a poison that withered crops and choked hope. In the east, the once proud city of Minas Ithil fell under their spectral siege, its moonlit towers crumbling beneath a tide of nightmares. The last defenders spoke of a figure clad in midnight, his sword dripping with a darkness that seeped into the stones, the Witch King, first and most terrible of the 9. Where he walked, courage curdled like milk in the sun. The balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had been cleaved in two. Yet even in the spreading shadow, flickers of defiance remained. The dwarves, though consumed by gold lust, never bowed. Their rings, forged in duplicity, became shackles Sauron couldn't quite tighten, proof that some fires burned too hot to be quenched by even the Dark Lord's hand. And far to the west, in hushed conversations between elves and exiled men, a single question lingered like smoke. If the rings of power could be turned to ruin, might they also, one day, be turned to ruin's undoing? The 3 rings thrummed softly in their keeper's hands, not with the fevered pulse of Sauron's one, but with a quieter, steadier light, like embers banked against a coming storm. In the hidden valleys of Rivendell, Elrond raised Vilya's sapphire to the setting sun, its glow casting long shadows across the waterfalls that veiled his refuge. Here, in this hushed sanctuary, the air itself seemed to hum with ancient songs, the very stones remembering the wisdom of ages. Yet even as scholars and refugees streamed through the valley's hidden paths, Elrond's gaze often drifted eastward, where the misty mountains clawed at a sky grown heavy with smoke. Galadriel's realm in Lothlorien was no less veiled, though its defenses were woven less of stone than of memory and dream. The golden leaves of the malorn trees whispered secrets in a tongue even the wind could not decipher, and Nenya's diamond shimmered like frost on spider silk as she moved between the silver trunks. Those who entered the golden wood spoke of time bending, of days that stretched like honey and nights that passed in a breath. But Galadriel, standing barefoot in the grass beside her mirror, saw none of its beauty. The water showed only fractures, black sails on the horizon, a thrush lying lifeless in the snow, a halfling's hand trembling over a ring of gold. She closed her eyes. The war would not come with trumpets. It would come on small, quiet feet, bearing a burden too heavy for any one soul to carry. And at the gray havens, where the sea sighed against the quays, Círdan the shipwright kept Narya's flame alive in the lanterns that guided lost mariners home. The oldest of the ring-bearers, his face was a map of salt and wind, his eyes holding the patience of tides. To the elves who lingered on Middle-earth shores, he offered neither false hope nor despair, only the steady glow of the ring's ruby on his finger, reminder that some fires could outlast even the darkest night. Ships slipped westward, their sails pale as moth wings, but Círdan remained. His work was not yet done, yet for all their secrecy, the three could not fully escape the pull of the one. On nights when the wind howled down from Mordor, the rings grew heavy, their song fraying at the edges like a rope under strain. Galadriel would wake gasping, her palms stinging as if she'd grasped a blade bare-handed. Elrond's healers murmured of wounds that would not close, of fevers that burned with no visible cause, and Círdan, staring into the flames of his harbor beacons, sometimes caught a flicker of something darker, a shadow where no shadow should be. The elves had bought time, not victory. Their realms stood as flickering candles in a gathering storm, beautiful and fragile. Galadriel, tracing the edge of her mirror, let a single drop of water fall into its depths. The ripples spread, distorting her reflection until it was no longer an elf maiden who stared back, but a queen terrible and tall, her hair lit with the fire of the One Ring's forge. She recoiled, the vision shattered, but the truth remained. The longer Sauron's shadow grew, the harder it would be to remember that light was not just for hiding, but for kindling. Sauron's fury echoed across Mordor like thunder, trapped in a canyon. The Dark Lord's gaze, now unshackled from the fair guise of Annatar, swept westward, where the Three Elven Rings pulsed like stars just beyond his grasp. Their power taunted him, not merely for their strength, but for the defiance they represented. If the elves could wield rings untouched by his will, what other cracks might spiderweb through his dominion? His first move was silence. Shadows slipped past the borders of Lothlorien on moonless nights, their footsteps muffled by layers of enchantment older than the trees themselves. But Galadriel's mirror had already shown her their coming. The assassins' shapeshifters cloaked in stolen faces found themselves wandering in circles, the very air thickening with illusions until they forgot their purpose entirely. Beneath the Malorn's golden boughs, Nenya glimmered coldly in Galadriel's palm. "This is only the beginning," she murmured to the empty glade. In Rivendell, Elrond's scouts brought darker tidings. A caravan of dwarven merchants, their beards stiff with frost, spoke of black-cloaked riders questioning travelers near the misty mountains. Not orcs, not men, something worse. The descriptions sent a chill through the last homely house, tall figures whose very presence made torches gutter, their voices like dry leaves scraping stone. The nine were hunting, yet for all Sauron's cunning, he underestimated the quiet rebellion taking root. In the cellars of Imladris, a gray-cloaked figure bent over a map, his fingers tracing hidden pathways through the mountains. Mithrandir, Elrond greeted him, though the name felt too small for the weight in the room. The wizard's eyes, usually alight with stories, were grave. "They'll need a guide," he said, tapping the parchment where a hobbit-sized footprint had been inked beside the Shire's borders. Someone Sauron wouldn't think to watch. Far to the south, where the Anduin carved its path through emerald plains, another whisper spread, this one carried by mortal tongues. A ragged minstrel, his lute missing half its strings, sang of a king without a crown hiding in the wild. The song was dismissed as tavern fancy, but in the dark of night, the singer pressed a scrap of parchment into a ranger's calloused hand. The message bore no words, only the sketch of a white tree wrapped in thorns. Sauron's spies scurried through every kingdom, but the wind carried secrets even he couldn't intercept. When a lone eagle soared high above the Ephel-Juath, its sharp eyes glimpsed something the dark tower's sentries missed. A conclave of elves, dwarves, and men gathering in a hidden valley, their fires banked low. No banners flew, no horns sounded, just hands clasped over daggers and a shared, silent oath. The shadow stretched longer each day, but against it, tiny sparks refused to be snuffed out. And in the deepest vaults of Barad-dûr, where the very walls throbbed with malice, the one ring lay heavy on its chain. It trembled, ever so slightly, as if sensing the distant hum of its lost kin. Somewhere beyond the ashen ruin, 3 lights still burned, and light, as even Sauron knew in his blackest heart, was the one thing shadows could never swallow whole. The banners of Lindon and Númenor flapped in the sulphurous wind as the hosts of the last alliance gathered on the plains of Dagorlad, a sea of spear points and grim faces stretching farther than even elven eyes could see. Gil-galad's armor gleamed like captured moonlight, his spear eglows humming with a restless energy, while Elendil stood tall beside him, the shards of Narsil already thirsting for vengeance. Together, elf and man had marched to the very threshold of Mordor, their alliance a fragile thread, stitching together the last free peoples of Middle-earth. Yet even as their armies arrayed for battle, whispers slithered through the ranks. The rings were stirring. Some of the Númenorian captains clutched their swords too tightly, their eyes darting toward the shadows, as if expecting phantom fingers to close around their throats. These were the descendants of those who'd once been gifted rings of power, their bloodline thinned by generations of whispered deals and slow corruption. One lord, his cloak lined with mithril threads, vanished on the eve of battle, his tent empty save for a single, tarnished ring left, spinning on the ground like a dropped coin. Others resisted, their defiance burning brighter as the drums of Mordor shook the earth. Elendil himself wore no ring, but his son Isildur kept a curious golden band tucked in a pouch at his belt, a trinket he'd claimed from an orc chieftain's corpse. It hummed against his hip, a sound he told himself was merely the distant rumble of Orodruin. Gil-galad felt the weight of the unseen war as keenly as any blade. Though the 3 rings remained hidden far from the battlefield, their presence, or rather, their absence loomed large. Without them, the elven forces relied on older magics, enchantments woven into their armor, songs of power that could shatter orc iron, and the sheer, stubborn light of their spirits. Yet even these flickered when the Nazgûl descended, their black steeds screaming like damned souls. The Witch King's mace shattered a dozen shields in a single swing, his laughter curling like smoke through the ranks. "Where are your rings now, heralds of light?" he taunted, his voice the scrape of a tomb door swinging open. But in the chaos, a single moment crystallized the stakes of the entire war. As Sauron himself emerged from the gates of Barad-dûr towering, wreathed in flame, the One Ring blazing on his hand like a fallen star, Gil-galad and Elendil charged. Eglows pierced the Dark Lord's armor, Narsil bit deep into his flesh, and for an instant, the tides of fate wavered. Then Sauron's fist closed around Gil-galad's throat, and the High King of the Elves burned from the inside out, his body crumbling to ash in Elendil's arms. Yet with his last breath, Gil-galad twisted Eglows upward, not to strike, but to reflect the pale sunlight into Sauron's eyes. Blinded, the Dark Lord stumbled. Elendil's roar shook the battlefield as he swung Narsil with all the strength of his dying people. The sword shattered on impact, but not before cleaving the One Ring from Sauron's hand. The Dark Lord's scream split the sky, his form unraveling like a nightmare at dawn. Victory, or so it seemed, had been bought with the blood of kings. Yet as the smoke cleared, Isildur knelt in the mud, his fingers closing around the ring where it lay, still warm. The battle had been won. The war, as all who'd felt the ring's whisper knew, was far from over. Isildur's fingers closed around the One Ring, its warmth seeping into his palm like a living thing. Around him, the battlefield lay strewn with the broken bodies of elves and men, the air thick with the stench of smoke and iron. Victory had come at a cost too terrible to name. Gil-galad's ashes scattered on the wind, Elendil's lifeless form still clutching the hilt of shattered Narsil. And yet, as the ring pulsed against his skin, a whisper threaded through Isildur's grief, soft and insistent as a heartbeat. "This is your legacy. This is your strength." The elves urged him to destroy it. Círdan's weathered face was grim as he gestured toward the fires of Mount Doom, visible even at this distance. "Cast it into the flame," he insisted, his voice rough with exhaustion. While Sauron's spirit is weak, the ring's power can be undone. Elrond, his armor streaked with soot and blood, echoed the plea, his eyes dark with a foresight Isildur couldn't or wouldn't share. But the ring's voice was louder. It showed him flashes of Gondor rebuilt, of a kingdom greater than Numenor in its prime, of enemies kneeling not in fear, but in awe. How could he throw away such a gift? The moment the decision settled in his bones, the world seemed to tilt. The ring's weight in his hand became more than physical. It was a yoke, a crown, a chain, all at once. When he slipped it onto his finger, the battlefield vanished. The cries of the wounded, the crackle of dying fires, even the taste of blood on his lips, all of it melted away. For the first time, Isildur saw Middle-earth as Sauron had, a tapestry of frail, scrambling lives, waiting to be woven into order. His breath hitched. The vision was intoxicating, but the elven lord saw only a man swaying on his feet, his eyes glazed with something that wasn't triumph. Elrond reached for him, but Isildur staggered back, the ring flashing gold as he tore it from his finger. The world rushed back in a deafening wave. "It's mine," he panted, as much to himself as to them. "My father's blood bought it. I will not let that sacrifice be wasted." High above, unnoticed by any in that moment, a shadow stirred, a wisp of malice, clinging to the wind where Sauron's form had dissolved. The Dark Lord was diminished, but not gone. His will seeped into the earth like poison, pooling in dark places where orcs and worse things lurked. The ring had been cut from his hand, but its song still reached him, a thread of discord woven into Isildur's pride. And so the war ended not with an ending, but a pause. The One Ring passed into the hands of men, its true nature hidden behind the justification of inheritance and kingship. The elves returned to their dwindling realms, the three rings hidden deeper than ever. But in the quiet of his tent, Isildur would find himself turning the ring over in his hands, tracing its flawless circle with a thumb, as if trying to solve a riddle written in a language just beyond his grasp. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but deafening. What happens when a weapon thinks it's a trophy? Somewhere in the east, a mountain exhaled fire, as if in answer. The three rings slept like embers beneath the earth, never extinguished, never flaunted, their power banked against the long night, stretching over Middle-earth. Galadriel wore Nenya's diamond in the heart of Lothlorien, its light veiled by enchantments, so deep even the leaves of the Malorn trees seemed to forget its presence. Yet those who walked her realm knew in their bones that time moved differently there. A traveler might enter the Golden Wood at dawn and emerge a decade older, while the elves within aged not a day. Nenya's magic was subtle, a whisper of preservation in a world crumbling toward shadow. But when Galadriel passed her mirror's silver basin, the water showed not reflections, but possibilities, glimpses of a future where the ring's power might not be enough. Elrond's stewardship of Vilya in Rivendell was no less guarded. The sapphire's strength hummed through the valley's foundations, its energy woven into the very waterfalls that shielded Imladris from prying eyes. Wounded elves recovered faster within its borders, their fevers breaking as if the air itself willed them healed. Yet Elrond seldom spoke of the ring, even to his closest kin. Its power was a burden, not a boon. One misstep, and the sanctuary he'd built could become a beacon for Sauron's wrath. When council fires burned late into the night, his fingers would stray to the ring's hidden place beneath his robes, as if reassuring himself it hadn't stirred in answer to some distant call. And then there was Gandalf. When Círdan, the shipwright, pressed Narya into the wizard's gnarled hands at the Grey Havens, the old mariner's eyes held a warning the ring's fire could not eclipse. "This is not a tool," he murmured, "but a test." Unlike the elves, Gandalf had no homeland to preserve, no people to shield, only the tangled threads of 100 fragile alliances. Narya's flame kindled courage in the hearts of those he met, from the shivering hobbits of the Shire to the battle-weary rangers of the north. Yet with every spark he lit, the weight of the ring grew heavier. Fire warms, yes, but it also devours. The legacy of the three was a paradox, as delicate as the morning mist on the Bruinen. They were weapons that dared not strike, shields that could not falter. Galadriel's mirror showed her the cost of using them openly. A single flare of Nenya's light might draw the Nazgûl like moths to a lantern. Elrond's healers mended bodies, but the ring's true work was holding back time itself, and time was a tide not even Vilya could forever resist. And Gandalf, he walked a razor's edge, fanning hope in secret, while the enemy's gaze scoured the land for the faintest flicker of his ruby's glow. In the end, the three's greatest power was their silence. While Saurons will clawed at the edges of the world, searching for the rings he knew must exist. Their bearers wielded something far more dangerous than magic: patience. The elves had learned the hard way that power, even well-intentioned, could be a snare, so they waited and watched, and wove their protections thread by thread. For if the Dark Lord's greatest weakness was his hunger for dominion, theirs was the understanding that some battles are won not by strength, but by outlasting the storm. And storms, after all, cannot rage forever. The centuries unspooled like a river in twilight, slow and silent, carrying the rings of power down strange currents of fate. The one ring vanished, slipping from history's grass, lost in the murky depths of the Anduin, or so the tales claimed, yet its absence was no comfort. Like a phantom limb, its presence throbbed in the veins of Middle-earth, tugging at the three with a hunger that never slept. In Lothlorien, where golden leaves fell in endless autumn, Galadriel's fingers tightened around Nenya's chill band. The ring's diamond flickered in the dappled light, its magic weaving the very air into a sanctuary where time pooled like honey. But beneath the Malorn tree's serenity, she felt the truth. This was not preservation. It was defiance. Every thread of enchantment was a rope stretched taut against the tide of darkness, buying moments at a cost only the ring's bearers understood. The elves who lingered in her realm grew fewer with each passing year, their voices fading like echoes. How long before the rope snapped? Elrond's hands, scarred from ancient wars, traced the hidden weight of Vilya beneath his robes as he stood on the balcony of Rivendell. Below, the Bruinen's laughter masked the whispers of the ring's sapphire, its power threading through the valley like roots, holding back a cliff's edge. Refugees from Dale, dwarves from the lonely mountain, even the rare wandering hobbit, all found solace here, unaware of the delicate spell that slowed decay just enough to let hope breathe. But Elrond's dreams had grown jagged, visions of a fiery eye turning westward, searching, probing for the three's hiding places. A single misstep, a single flare of the ring's power, and Rivendell's waterfalls would run black with orc blood. And then there was Gandalf, the wanderer in grey, whose staff tapped a restless rhythm against the roads of Middle-earth. Narya's ruby burned unseen in his pocket, its fire kindling courage in the hearts of those he met. A farmer standing firm against bandits, a dwarf swallowing fear to face a dragon. But fire, he knew, was a fickle ally. Too much, and it would betray him. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the stars seemed to hold their breath, he'd press the ring to his forehead, its warmth a reminder of the fine line between kindling and conflagration. For all their power, the three were shackled by a cruel irony. The moment Sauron reclaimed the one, their magic would twist into his service. Every spell of preservation, every whispered enchantment, would become a noose around the free people's throats. Galadriel saw it in her mirror, a future where Nenya's light gilded the chains of Dol Guldur. Elrond heard it in the wind's howl, the echoes of Vilya's strength, fueling the towers of Barad-dûr. And Gandalf, he smelled it in the smoke of burning villages, the stench of Narya's hope, turned to ash in the Dark Lord's palm. Yet they endured, not because they believed in victory, but because surrender was a luxury the world could not afford. The rings hummed on, their song a counterpoint to the one silent scream across the years. And somewhere, in the shadowed places where even the wise feared to tread, a golden band waited patient as a spider in its web, for the hour when its voice would be heard again. The War of the Ring began not with a roar, but a whisper, a hobbit's trembling fingers closing around a golden band in the shadows of a cave. When news of the One Ring's rediscovery reached Lothlorien, the very leaves of the Malorn trees seemed to shudder. Galadriel stood motionless in her glade, Nenya's diamond cold against her skin, her mirror's waters swirling with visions of fire and blood. The choice before her was cruel in its simplicity. Use the ring's power to defend her people and risk drawing Sauron's eye like a beacon in the night, or withhold its light and watch Lorien fall. Neither path led to victory, both demanded sacrifice. In Rivendell, Elrond paced the length of his moonlit halls, Vilya sapphire humming beneath his robes like a second heartbeat. The council had ended hours ago, yet the weight of Frodo's quest pressed heavier than any mountain. With the One Ring unearthed, the Three's enchantments teetered on a knife's edge. Every spell he'd woven, every wound healed, every valley shielded now hung by a thread. To summon Vilya's full strength might buy Middle-earth time, but at what cost? The moment its light flared, Barad-dûr's gaze would lock onto Imladris like a hawk spotting prey, and yet to do nothing as darkness devoured the world felt like betrayal. Gandalf's staff struck the cobblestones of Minas Tirith with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the empty streets. Narya's ruby lay hidden in the folds of his cloak, its fire banked to the faintest ember. He'd spent centuries kindling hope, in secret whispering courage to kings, coaxing stubbornness from hobbits, reminding even the weariest warrior that shadows could be weathered. But now, with Mordor's armies massing at the Black Gates, the temptation to unleash Narya's full fury gnawed at him. One burst of its flame could rally broken armies, steel trembling hearts, but it would also scream his presence to the Nazgûl, painting every soul he sought to protect as a target. The Three had been crafted to preserve, to inspire, to heal, never as weapons. Yet as Sauron's shadow stretched across the land, their bearers faced an impossible calculus: wield them and accelerate the enemy's triumph, or withhold them and watch all they loved crumble. Galadriel's fingers curled into fists, her reflection in the mirror twisting, first into a queen radiant with terrible power, then back into herself, weary and resolute. The ring's whispers slithered through her mind, promising strength enough to cast down dark towers, to rule in place of the Dark Lord. Her laughter, when it came, was bitter as winter wind. "I passed the test," she murmured to the empty glade. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." Elrond's choice was written in the lines of his face as he watched his daughter Arwen kneel beside a mortal man in the gardens below. To call upon Vilya now would be to gamble her future, and all futures, on a single desperate stroke. Instead, he pressed his palm to the valley's ancient stones, letting the ring's power seep into the earth, not as a shield, but as a silent promise. Rivendell would stand, not through force, but by enduring, and Gandalf, he stood atop the walls of Gondor as dawn bled across the sky, Narya's weighed a secret inferno in his pocket. The battle would be won or lost by hands far smaller than his, a hobbit's stubbornness, a king's reclaimed destiny. His task wasn't to kindle fire, but to trust that the sparks he'd spent centuries nurturing would catch. When the One Ring finally tumbled into Mount Doom's heart, the Three didn't scream. They sighed. Their light wove itself into the dawn's glow one last time, lifting the weight of centuries from their bearers' shoulders. The magic hadn't failed. It had served its purpose, and as the last ship sailed westward, carrying the ring-bearers beyond the circles of the world. The malorn leaves of Lothlorien fell like gold rain, unburdened at last. The moment the One Ring dissolved into the molten heart of Mount Doom, a ripple passed through the very fabric of Middle-earth, not with a crash, but a sigh. In Lothlorien, Galadriel's hand flew to Nenya as the diamond's glow flickered like a candle in a sudden draft. The golden leaves overhead, once suspended in eternal autumn, trembled. A single malorn leaf broke free, drifting downward in a way it hadn't in centuries, not because she willed it, but because time, at last, had reclaimed its hold. The air in the forest grew lighter, yet somehow emptier, as if the enchantment that had woven the trees into a dreamscape was unraveling thread by thread. She closed her eyes. The mirror's waters would show only reflections now, no longer futures. Elrond felt it too, the shift in Vilya's song, the sapphire's hum softening into silence against his chest. The waterfalls of Rivendell still cascaded, but their music was just water now, no longer threaded with the subtle magic that had made them echo with ancient harmonies. He stood at the edge of the valley, watching elves pause mid-task, their hands hovering over unfinished carvings or half-strung harps. The weightlessness was disorienting. For millennia, the rings had been a crutch, a bulwark against decay. Now, stripped of their power, the elves faced a truth they delayed. Their time was ending not with a roar, but a whisper. And Gandalf, no longer the grey, now robed in white, let Narya's ruby slip from his fingers into Círdan's waiting palm at the Grey Havens. The warmth that had kindled courage in so many hearts was cooling, its fire banked. "It's done," the wizard murmured, though the words felt both too heavy and too light for what had been sacrificed. The ships waited, their sails taut with a wind that smelled of salt and something older, something beyond the circles of the world. The rings hadn't just been tools, they'd been promises, promises that beauty could be preserved, that loss could be held at bay. Now, with Sauron's shadow scrubbed from the sky, the elves faced the bittersweet truth. Victory meant letting go. Lothlorien would still stand, but its gold would fade. Rivendell's halls would echo, but no longer with spells woven into the stone. And the sea longing, once a quiet ache, now swelled into a tide too strong to resist. As the last ships dwindled on the horizon, Middle-earth breathed anew, lighter, freer, but undeniably changed. The Age of Rings was over. What came next would be written by hands unburdened by their glow. The rings of power leave behind a legacy as intricate as the enchantments woven into their metal, threads of brilliance entwined with ruin, ambition shackled to deceit. Celebrimbor's hands may have crafted them, but their story was written in the choices of those who carried them. Galadriel's refusal of dominion, Elrond's quiet stewardship, Gandalf's kindling of hope in the darkest hours. Even Sauron, for all his malice, became a dark mirror to their purpose, proof that power, unchecked by wisdom, corrupts absolutely. The rings were never mere objects. They were tests, and in the end, they measured not strength, but character. As the last elven ships vanished into the western horizon, the shores of Middle-earth stood quieter, as if the very air mourned the passing of an age. The elves had been the keepers of light, the weavers of song, but their time was over. Their realms, Lothlorien's golden glades, Rivendell's cascading waterfalls, would fade into legend, their beauty preserved only in the ink of scribes and the memories of those who had walked beneath their boughs. Yet their departure was not defeat. The rings had been outlived by the very things they were meant to preserve: courage that needed no enchantment, hope that required no flame. In the halls of men and dwarves, the rings became cautionary tales, whispers of a time when magic had danced too close to shadow. The 7 and the 9 lay spent, their power drained with Sauron's fall, leaving behind only twisted metal and the ghosts of kings who had traded their souls for empty promises. But the 3, their fate was more poetic. Without the one to anchor them, their magic dissolved like morning mist, returning to the earth from which they'd been forged. Galadriel's diamond, Elrond's sapphire, Gandalf's ruby, each became simple jewels again, their light now a memory rather than a force, and yet their legacy lingers. Not in spells or artifacts, but in the choices they inspired: Frodo's mercy, Sam's loyalty, Aragorn's humility. These were the true counterweights to the ring's corruption. The elves may have sailed, but the world they left behind was shaped by those who had learned the hardest lesson of all: that some temptations must be resisted not with greater power, but with the strength to let go. The forges of Eregion are cold now, their anvils silent, but if you listen closely, in the wind that rustles through the ruins, you might still hear it, the echo of hammers shaping metal, of voices raised in triumph and despair, of a story that refuses to be forgotten. The rings are gone, the reckoning they brought is not, and perhaps in the end that was their purpose, to remind us that power is never just a tool, it's a mirror. And what stares back is always, inevitably, ourselves. you.